Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stan. I'm Owen. This is Dara. We are powerlifting coaches who help and have helped thousands of lifters from all the way from their first competition with like 120 kilo back squat to someone trying to squat 300 kilos. We've helped everyone in between, and we're trying to bring some of that better information so you can improve your own training. Now, one of the very important aspects of powerlifting training is the use of assistance work. So assistance work makes up a large chunk of your training. It can be quite useful, but deciding what to do, given that there is hundreds of different exercises and multiple different variations of any one exercise, deciding what to do and which one to use can be very, very useful for your training. So today we're going to look at what you might need to look at in regards to what you're doing and what you might want to get out of it and how to choose the best assistance exercise for you.
So the first question you should ask is, what do I need? So whether you're programming for yourself or you're a lifter looking at your own program or you're programming for another lifter, then the first thing is a somewhat basic needs analysis. So a lot of time we'll write our programs, we'll put squats, presses, pulls, rows in there, and we'll know our volume on those. We'll know when we want to peak. We'll know when we want to hit the high intensity stuff. And then we'll basically fill out the other days of the week with our accessory movements. Now we might put the accessories into upper body, lower body and midline work. We might put it to single leg, double leg stuff. We might have it bodybuilding focused or strength focused, but the first thing is having an honest chat with yourself or with the athlete and seeing what's actually needed. So there are multiple components to accessory work. There are multiple silos into which accessory work will fill, and the first of these is hypertrophy. So if you're somebody and maybe the low bar position is causing you some issues and maybe you need just some upper back mass, we'll look at other very, very effective lifters. John Hack is one that comes to mind. We'll see big traps, we'll see big rear delts, we'll see a great upper back position with the barbell. Now, if that's the case, then we'll say hypertrophy work, generally speaking, 2 to 3 times a week is going to be enough there. That's our frequency worked out. We might also go on to look at that then, at that hypertrophy work, and make sure it's not clashing anywhere along the road. It mightn't necessarily be a hypertrophy issue, but you could have a strength issue. So maybe at the very end of that lockout on the bench press, you're just missing some of that lockout strength you need. Maybe it's on the deadlift, you're missing some of that grip strength. In those cases, these are specific strength training pieces that you'll need to do. Mostly we'll be going from a large compound multi-muscle movement like the squat, the deadlift or the press, and we're going to start looking more at the isolation work. When we go from hypertrophy to strength training, a lot of time people think hypertrophy is just purely this high volume work. Strength training is much more those lower reps, and generally speaking, from a 10,000 foot view, that is correct. But when we're starting our strength training, it's very important we have a requisite amount of volume to be bringing about some work capacity in that piece. So if I was to immediately go to maximal strength or maximal intensity on grip training, then it's not going to be as effective as if I spent the initial 2, 4 or 6 weeks building some work capacity in those muscles, building up a small bit of that work capacity in that specific range, and then going into those higher intensity, lower volume sets. The slightly less thought about in terms of accessory work might be stability, range of motion, or making ourselves a small bit more resilient to injury. So let's take stability first as an example. Now, stability or a lack of stability usually comes from, first, the range of motion we can actually control. So a lot of us might be slightly unstable in the bottom of our squat. We might be very stable as we sit down. Just as we pass below parallel, then the wheels can fall off a small bit. Our knees might shoot out to the side. Our hips might shoot back below, or our upper back might round forward slightly. In that case, that could just be due to tight hip flexors. We mightn't have the range of mobility we need in our ankles, or we mightn't have the requisite strength in our upper back. All of these things come from a lack of range of motion, but they all have a slightly different solution. The last thing I mentioned here is the idea of becoming a bit more resilient to injury. And accessory work is an absolutely great way of getting there. If you find something like knees become inflamed at a certain point in your training cycle, or your bicep tendon always becomes inflamed in the last 3 weeks of your deadlift peak, then what we're probably looking at here is the tendons not being developed to be fully resilient against against that kind of inflammation that will occur at the top end weights. Now, there are multiple videos out there on training your tendons, but generally speaking, we're going to start with some isolation pieces. Once we become very proficient at those isometric isolated movements or lack of movement, such as a plank or an isometric hold, once we can do that for a certain amount of time with a certain loading on us, the next move on from there is something that's actually going to load the tendon. So our tendon can be thought of like a bungee cord that's attached between a trailer and a truck that's pulling that trailer. If I always move the truck very slowly, that tendon is just going to stretch a certain amount, and then the trailer will follow along basically every single time. Now, we need a certain amount of dynamic loading when we're looking to really develop that tendon strength. And it might be that during those heavier weights and the squats, you drop a bit faster or you rely on that stretch shortening cycle a bit more. And because of that, we have a quadriceps tendon that isn't being developed for maybe 75% of our training cycle. And only when we get to those heavier weights, that tendon actually starts stretching and reflexing. In that case, we start with our isometrics, then we make sure it's being trained effectively in that stretch shortening cycle, and there we can make ourselves a small bit more resilient to injury.
So we've decided what kind of assistance exercise we're going to do, what ones we're going to do. We need to really put a bit of a metric on how important these assistance exercises are. Realistically, they're never going to replace that squat, bench and deadlift, the main variations, but they can be incredibly beneficial. There's a couple of different categories you could look at these in. There is performance, maybe injury prevention or pain reduction for you. So for example, if towards the end of the training block, when you're low bar squatting at its highest intensity, your bicep tendon gets very, very sore, and you know that if you add in 2 sessions of bicep curls for 4 sets of 10 twice a week, you end up with a lot less pain in your tendon, or at least in the meantime it reduces the impact of the pain, and therefore it increases both your performance and reduces the pain because your performance feels a little bit better because you're in less pain. And as a result, we get something that's a very, very important assistance exercise. However, obvious, even though it may seem, we're not going to start doing bicep curls 4 or 5 times a week. We're either going to end up injuring ourselves, we're going to end up adding too much fatigue in our bicep, we may end up making that tendon more inflamed and making that pain worse on the low bar back squat. Similarly, if we're looking at something that increases our performance, for example, if we are very commonly rounding our back during our squat, or we're very commonly rounding our back and moving through more flexion in the deadlift, we may have a series of exercises that we know or that we want to try out that will help reduce this amount of flexion change. This might be lower back extensions, or it might be glute ham raise extensions or good mornings, something similar like that, that is targeting that specific area. We'll give this a sufficient period of time, but we can't go crazy with that. Even though the problem might be urgent, even though we really need to stop rounding our back in our deadlifts because we keep good morning, or we keep missing them, or we keep really reducing our speed of our lockout, or we keep missing our low bar squats forward because of that back rounding, there's only so fast that we can push our upper or lower back strength based on what we're trying to fix. So we can only do so many sessions of back raises, we can only do so many good morning sessions, we can only do so many sets of seal rows before it becomes either ineffective or far too fatiguing. So when we're looking at the order of importance and how much importance we put on these, we need to look at what we're using it for, and is it going to impact our main lifts, or is it going to hugely benefit them? So the use of the assistance exercises with the right amount, enough is enough. Too much is not better, more is not better. Just like more squatting isn't always better, more deadlifting isn't always better. Assistance work follows the same principle, and very often we'll see lifters either overshooting or vastly undershooting. And you can probably imagine upper body stuff is very often overshot and lower body stuff is very, very often undershot. So we'll give you an example, huge kind of sample basis here, but we have a particular squat program that we have on our app, the Road to Near Squat program, that thousands of lifters have ran, and one of the most frequent things we see is how hard people find the assistance work. Now you might be imagining 4 or 5 sessions of an hour long assistance work, but we have assistance work on one session, and then we have a variety of specific isolation work for the assistance work, and this looks like things like quarter squat, band resisted, pause squats with unweighted. Very, very light, very easy things, which people find incredibly difficult, and they find it hugely improves the quality of their squat, especially if it's something that's very low hanging fruit for them. So we'll see a frequent overshooting of loads of upper body pressing, loads of upper body rowing, even though we might not necessarily need that. And then we'll see a huge undershooting of that lower body assistance work. No one wants to do reverse lunges. No one wants to do super heavy Bulgarian split squats. But if you want to progress them, we're probably not going to get enough work just from the big lifts. You might be a freak of nature. You might be on 2 grams of PEDs, which can happen sometimes in powerlifting, and you can probably progress very well from just doing the big lifts. But for most of us, you're probably not on PEDs, so you need to be super smart with your training. And one of those areas that the natural powerlifter can make up a lot of the benefit in that volume is really smart selection of the assistance work. So it is super important, but it's so important to realize that enough is enough and more isn't always better. So more upper back, more lower body, more adduction, more abduction of the hips, more single leg lower body work in the right places is very, very useful. And if it's a pain reduction or if it helps you feel a lot better, it's incredibly useful. But again, more is not better. So you really need to just look at, why are you doing this? How important is this? How much do I need to apply? For example, a certain amount of a medicine is great, but more of that medicine isn't going to benefit you. It can make the problem a lot worse. You end up with other problems. So you just need to decide, how important is this for me? What are my reasons for it? And is it a legitimate reason, or do you just want to do more dumbbell bench press 4 times a week? And that might be okay, but it certainly mightn't be the best thing for your performance. So being honest with yourself, like Dara talked about there, doing a needs analysis for why you're doing this assistance work and what your rationale for that is. There's nothing wrong with being wrong with your rationale. You can say, this training block, I am going to do seal rows twice a week, and I am going to absolutely improve my upper back stability when I'm deadlifting. And then you look at the end of the training block, you look at the end of the 12 or 16 weeks, and you go, you know what, that really improved it, and I've got some good evidence for myself here. But let's say you picked the barbell good mornings twice a week, and you thought it would be plenty, you thought it would be sufficient, but it made no change, or maybe it was too much for you and you ended up with a lot of fatiguing in your deadlift sessions. So you need to be honest with what you're doing. You need to make sure that you're doing the appropriate amount of that, and it follows some very general principles, but objective analysis of what you're doing and how important it is and why you're really doing it and what you need to do is incredibly important for the choice of your assistance work.
You figured out what you need to get better at. You figured out how much of that work you can do each week and why you're going to do each of those amounts. The final kind of piece here is, what is the best exercise to get you there? So above all else, we see exercise selection being brought about by observing other people. And oftentimes we observe other people, come to a somewhat false conclusion, and then bring that into our training. A classic case of this is we saw a lot of CrossFitters doing GHD sit-ups for a long time. CrossFitters have massive jacked abs. Then a lot of people went straight into GHD sit-ups and came up against a whole host of issues here. Now, what makes a good assistance or accessory exercise? The first thing is that it's not going to be overly fatiguing. It's very important that assistance exercise is put into the training program to assist the other movements you're doing, to assist the main outcomes of your training. So if I go straight in and I use a phenomenally useful assistance tool, such as the belt squat, why would I choose that over a heels raised high bar back squat? The first reason the belt squat is so commonly used and is so useful is it doesn't load the spine. So because that belt is around my hips, my spine isn't going to become overly fatigued. I then have that extra recovery capital to put into my back squats, to put into my deadlifts, my good mornings, and everything my spine is involved in. The second reason that the belt squat is so useful is because it allows us to achieve a certain position very easily that is harder to achieve during the main lifts themselves. So when we look at a belt squat, we can get our knees really far forward, we can keep our quads loaded throughout the entire range, and we get a really good range of motion when we're using it. So it's ticked 3 or 4 boxes immediately before we've even started using it. Now, the other side of this is what would make a bad accessory or assistance exercise. These things, generally speaking, will tax or hurt areas that are already going to be overly taxed or overly fatigued. The example of this would be assistant exercises that are incredibly grip dominant. So something like a farmer's carry with implements. they're really useful. They're great accessories for certain people at certain times, but generally speaking, we don't put them in powerlifting programs because the grip becomes the limiting factor, and then it brings down the overall quality of our main training pieces. Now, the other thing to talk about when doing that exercise selection piece is look at the lowest hanging fruit. The entry level is where we should be starting with all of this. We don't immediately want to go to a more complex thing. We don't always need to be looking for a better mousetrap. What we need to look at is the easiest and most effective mousetrap we can use. So this looks like normal bodyweight planks to start off with. Then after a few weeks of that, and maybe we've built the 2 minutes of normal planks, then the simplest move here is not to go to a more convoluted version of the plank, but simply increase the loading. Maybe we'll put a 10 or 20 kilo plate on our hips. Now we can use the same plank variation, a variation we've become very skilled with and we've become accustomed to training over the last number of weeks. And now we get that increased stimulus once you've built that initial work capacity. So when we're picking those exercises first day, it's not always looking for the most complicated one that's necessarily going to do everything at the same time. Start at the very bottom, the most entry level, and move upwards from there. The last thing I want to talk about when looking at exercise selection is make sure that there is a clear pathway for you to progress with that exercise. So certain exercises are very, very good and very effective, but we mightn't be able to scale them or progress them very easily as we go through a 12, 16 week or 24 week training block. An example of this would be wide grip pull-ups. So some of us might be very, very proficient with the pull-up, might be able to do 10 dead hang wide grip pull-ups from the start of a training block. But if I immediately start off by hitting 4 sets of 8 on those pull-ups, I don't have a massive upward range in which to reach into. The better example here would be something like a seated lat pull down. I start at the very light loadings on those machines. I accrue a lot of volume at the start. And then as I go through that progression scale upwards, I can continuously increase that intensity as I go from that high volume at the start to low volume at the end. The last thing with this, and the last idea I want to kind of portray here, is that when we look to progress accessory exercises, when we're selecting them at the start, is understand that many of these things sit upon a spectrum. So let's take the pull-ups and the lat pull down as an example. If I want to have some upper back pulling in there, I might start off with the most basic form. I might start off with ring rows. So I'll start with a ring row with my feet very, very close to the fulcrum point of those rings. Then I'll slowly move my feet further and further and further forward, thus increasing the load each week. Now, I might get to the point where I'm doing sets of 15 for multiple sets at the end of a training session and not feeling like I'm getting a massive amount of work done. I can then very easily move from the ring row onto a standard pull-up bar or onto ring pull-ups. Then once I go through that for maybe 8 to 12 weeks, then my pull-ups will be nice and strong, and I can even move on then to a weighted pull-up or onto a slightly more difficult variation of that. So don't always think about one exercise when we're picking those selections at the start and think about how I can just scale those. Think about those exercises as sitting on multiple rungs of a ladder, and I might move through 2 versions of a similar exercise or 3 versions of a similar exercise as I go throughout my training block.
So if you're really not sure where to start and you keep messing it up, or you feel like you just can't get it right, or you're halfway through your training block and you don't know what's going on, start with one hinge exercise for your lower body, one quad dominant assistance exercise for your lower body. Have one of those lower body exercises be a unilateral variation. So if you are doing stiff-legged deadlifts for your hinging assistance work, do something like single leg box step-ups for your quad. Have one horizontal pressing or one vertical pressing, pick one of those, and have one upper back assistance exercise. Just start with one of each. Again, with the upper body, have one of those as single arm or unilateral work. So if you pick something like strict press as your assistance exercise for pressing, have single arm dumbbell rows as your upper body unilateral back exercise. Then on top of that, just pick 2 different core exercises and pair them once a week. Stick with all of these, whatever one you pick, unless it hurts you, just pick it and stick with it for the next 12 to 16 weeks of your training block. Don't change anything. Just look for progression on volume, look for progression on intensity, or a combination of both of these. So while we have a lot of different things we were just talking about there, if you're really not sure and you just keep messing it up, or you have no idea where to start, or you're just new and you're just doing your own powerlifting block, follow those rules, stick with them. It might be suboptimal, but you just need to finish your training block, see where your squat, bench, and deadlift ended up, and then have a look at what those issues were. We'll touch on those at a different time in a different video on assistance work. But for now, just pick one of those, follow those rules, and you'll see where you end up. If you really want to just take your own programming out of your hands, let us do it for you. Download the Sikastrength app on iOS and Android. Everyone gets a 7-day free trial. We have our main powerlifting program, which people have ran incredibly successfully. We've also individual lifts like a bench program, a squat program, and a pulling program, all of which are incredibly efficient, incredibly effective. The app has video library, dynamic loading adjustment, CoachBot, access to our Facebook group. You get 2 programs for the price of your subscription, so you're getting incredible value for that. And check it out down below, iOS and Android. Everyone gets a 7-day free trial. So if you're even on the fence, you just need to have a look, download it, sign up, have a look around. You do not need to commit to it. You can literally cancel it before the end of 7 days, your free trial, and you won't be charged anything.